Good evening, everyone. I'm happy to welcome you to this first chat in a series. It's going to be a chat between Senator Martha Hennessey and myself. We've had some last-minute issues due to the fact that we all enjoy such low-quality broadband that I had to take off from my house and run to my office in order to connect to this meeting. But it looks like the connections are in order, everything is in order, and I'm very happy to be here. And I'm very happy to introduce Martha Hennessey. Hello, Martha.
Hello, it's very nice to be here.
It's very nice to be here talking with you about the Senate and what it takes to be a great senator. And first, let me just briefly tell you or remind you a little about what Martha Hennessey has done as a senator. She joined the House, the New Hampshire House, in 2014 and served there for 2 years. And from there, she went on to the Senate, and she's been our District 5 senator from 2016 to today, and it's still going. And she decided to step down last spring, and that's why we're having this conversation, because after she decided to step down, I decided to run. I think that the first thing that I'm going to ask Martha is about the Senate. She has 4 years experience in the Senate, and I think that most people are not thoroughly familiar with what it really takes to work in the Senate and to push legislation through the Senate. So I would like you to talk to us about it a little bit, but not give us, the nuts and bolts and the mechanics of how the legislature works, because that in the abstract, that actually is harder to follow, and it does not connect so well with what people really expect from us when we are in the legislature. So what I would like you to do is take one bill, and I have picked the bill for you, I'll admit that right now. Take one bill and then tell us how that bill went through the legislature, how the process worked, and how it went and ended up being signed as law by the governor. And the bill that I have picked is a bill that was, highly publicized just a few weeks ago, and it's the bill that you worked so hard on college sexual assault. And I remember that in a conversation that we had before I even decided that I was going to run, I was in the process of deciding, you said to me that that was a bill that really mattered to you a great deal. So why don't you use that bill as a case study to show us how the Senate worked? That would be wonderful.
I'm happy to. Thank you. It's a bill I'm happy to talk about. It turns out that when I first entered the Senate, or even actually when I first entered the House, I said to my people would say, well, what are you interested in working on? And one of the things I talked about right away was the issue of sexual assault on college campuses. As some people know, I was in the first years of coeducation at Dartmouth, and it was at a time, I was in the first year, and it was at a time when a lot of male colleges were beginning to accept women. And so it was a tricky time. And unfortunately, there were a lot of people I knew who were victims of sexual assault while they were on campus. I think there was a fair amount of anger at a lot of campuses about women coming on board and maybe even doing better than the men were doing. And it was a complicated thing. So the bill that I ended up with happened somewhat serendipitously. I kept trying to think about how to do it. I first talked with Rennie Cushing, who was in the House when I was in the House, saying, let's do something like this. And the time just didn't seem right. But the legislation that I've now actually had signed by the governor is Senate Bill 679, which requires institutions of higher learning to adopt and make available to students policies on dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. So it also requires the development of a task force and surveys on sexual misconduct, and for the reports to be made public. Some of the things are certainly already happening on this campus and on other campuses, but many campuses are missing pieces. It requires education around awareness of what it means to be assaulted on a college campus and how to avoid that, and also institutional awareness and prevention for sexual violence. In I think it was just about the last day that we were accepting legislation ideas. I had a young man who had recently graduated from college by the name of John Gabrielli, and he founded an organization of many young people called Every Voice Coalition. He had a very good friend in college who had, and not at Dartmouth, but who had been sexually assaulted, and it became something that he was determined to do something about. He's quite a remarkable young man. So he came to me very close to the last day that we could file, because he had been looking in the House for somebody to file this legislation. And first thing I said to him was, I already have too many bills. This is going to take too much time. I promised myself I wouldn't have that many, and because I'd had too many the year before. But after I listened to him talk, I thought, I have to do this. I absolutely have to do this. Was the reason I came into the legislature. And John had already done a lot of work before I met him. I ended up advising him on how it might work in New Hampshire, and people that he could talk to in New Hampshire for advice about it. But he had already brought this bill to Massachusetts and some other places where it didn't work out. So what happened was that it came to the Senate. It came to my committee, which I made sure happened, which was Judiciary, where I was the chair. And it also, he had really good people who testified in front of the committee. So it passed the Senate committee, the Judiciary Committee, unanimously. And then it went to the Senate as a full body, and it passed unanimously from the full body. And just as that was happening, we were entering into what's called crossover, which is when the House bills switch with the Senate bills. And we take up the House bills after they've seen them, and they take up the Senate bills. And that's exactly when COVID happened. So we entered into kind of a frenetic time when John and I were on the phone a lot saying, oh, what's going to happen? How do we do this? And if people are interested, I can talk more about how we solved it. But it became part of an omnibus bill, which we used to call Christmas tree bills, where you put a lot of bills together on one bill that becomes the vehicle for all the other bills. And that was because the GOP in the House decided that they didn't want to change the rules. They needed a 2/3 vote to allow something to happen after a certain date. And that date had passed because of COVID. So we used a House bill to be the vehicle, and then they were all related somehow to sexual assault issues. And John did an amazing job of talking with the governor and getting him to be in support. And it ended up passing unanimously in the full Senate, and then went to the House and passed. Maybe not unanimous. Almost nothing passes unanimously in the House, but as you know, but it was thrilling. And then when we signed, Donna Soucy, the Senate president, signed it, and then it went to the governor, and he signed it. Unfortunately, he didn't invite any of us to come to the signing ceremony, but
he did sign it. I mean, that was one of the few high points of the signature period.
That's right.
By the governor.
That's right. That's right. It was really thrilling. And I think that now John feels as if he can go on to other states saying, well, New Hampshire's done it. So it was very exciting.
Yeah.
So I have a question I would like to ask you. What issues did you work on in the House that you would still like to see as your priorities in the Senate?
Well, it's interesting because you were talking about this college bill being something that was on your mind, this issue of sexual assault being on your mind from the time when you became, a member of the House and then the Senate. I did not have that issue. I had a different one. I was very concerned and very committed to climate change, climate action, and climate justice. So when I went to the House, I tried to figure out a way in which I could work on legislature that would make a difference in that area. And what I did is that I asked to serve on the Science, Technology, and Energy Committee, and that took some doing because I had to persuade the chair of the fact that even though I was a literature professor, I could learn really fast and become a really productive member of Science, Technology, and Energy, and I did that. And then once I was part of that committee, I focused on two areas. The first one was energy. And in terms of energy, my work dealt with, again, two major areas. The first one was renewable energy and clean energy. And that's work that I did with many other Democrats, and that had to do with issues like, for instance, protecting and expanding RGGI, the Regional Green Gas Initiative, which is one of the major pieces in the puzzle of the fight against climate change in the Northeast region and everywhere, actually. So that was one part. The other one, I spent a lot of time working on, and actually I eventually got a bill through that was signed into law by Governor Lynch, was an energy efficiency bill, because I realized that in this state there were a number of issues. One of them was the sources of energy. The other one was the cost of energy, and that the cheapest energy was the energy that you don't use. So that was already an incentive to try to lower the cost of energy. But in addition to that, the way to the easiest way to deal with that was to make buildings energy efficiency. And I worked on, what I did is that I brought to the state something called PACE. PACE stands for Property Assessed Clean Energy, and it provides a mechanism that allows property owners to retrofit their houses or their buildings for energy efficiency without having to put up a huge amount of money upfront or going into big debt. And I won't give you the details, but that's what it is. So those were the two areas in relation to energy. But then I worked on broadband. And I worked on broadband because at that time, even though we didn't have COVID-19, now everybody realizes just how important a good internet connection is. And that's why I had to drive, without speeding, from my house all the way to the college to be able to attend this meeting. At that time, the basic vision among a lot of people was that, high-speed internet, that was the kind of thing that people wanted to download videos and do a lot of streaming and so on. But I realized at the time that it was a crucial tool for the state's prosperity, that it was crucial to have that kind of internet accessibility for businesses to move to the areas, for rural areas not to be left behind, for medicine to be available in areas where there were no hospitals, for high quality school programs to be available when nothing else was. And that's what I did. I worked with David Pierce, who was then the senator for District 5, and we developed two major bills. The first one failed miserably in the House. The second one went through the House with a big majority, but then it was stopped at the Senate. So those were the two areas I worked on. Do I think that I'm going to continue with them? Absolutely. I'm going to continue with them because there is a lot to be done in both areas. But in addition to that, I'm going to be working on a lot of issues that have been longstanding issues, but that have become much more critical with the current pandemic crisis.
Excellent.
But I went from the House, I stayed in the House. And if I go to the Senate, I'd be going from the House to the Senate. You did the same thing. You started in the House and then you went to the Senate. And my question to you is, how did you feel, if at all, that your experience in the House was helpful, was important in your work in the Senate? When you joined the Senate, did you have the sense that what you had done in the House was really important in terms of experience and training and skills and so on? Or was it just 2 more years?
Well, I thank you for asking that question, because it's one that has been on my mind a lot as I have been talking to candidates and thinking about what made a difference for me and looking back on my time there. Honestly, I wish I'd had longer in the House. I wish I'd had as long as you've had in the House, because 2 years was not enough. The learning curve is incredibly steep, and there's so much to learn. But nonetheless, if I hadn't had those 2 years, I think I would have been just drowning when I was in the Senate. There were just so many things that you don't know. Even lingo or acronyms, that there are so many of them, that I had to ask the people next to me the first year of my first term in the House. I had to say, well, what in the world does that mean? So by the time I got to the Senate, I felt as though I knew a lot about that. I knew how to read and write and think critically about bills, because I had seen so many bills. As you know, when you're in a committee, you see hundreds of bills, and you have to, it takes some time to get to know what you're looking for in those bills. And that was really important to me. In the Senate, you finish a bill, and in the House, and the Office of Legislative Services sends you a bill and says, how is this, essentially? And you have to make that decision. So a lot rests on that. But I also learned where to go for help. I used the research office. I knew that leadership was a good place to go for help. And in my previous lives, I'd never been very good at that, but it's really critical when you're in the legislature. I also learned how not only to do my homework before I presented a bill, which was really important so that you don't make a fool of yourself in front of a committee, but also I learned about the fact that there are many different factions within the legislative process that I needed to include. I needed to figure out who might be opposed to this. So I'd look at if the bill had been addressed before, for example, and then and there's a wonderful research facility for the organization for the Senate, and they would look into that for me. And I also did do homework just to know about a lot of the issues. I mean, when a Reggie bill came to the House or the Senate, I had to figure out what the heck Reggie stood for. Honestly, I'm sorry to say that, but I'm glad you know. I think there was more I did not know about the legislature than there was what I did know when I first showed up. I thought I was a little cocky about it. I thought, hey, I've done a lot of hard things. I can do this. But it's another world, as you know very well. It takes a lot of sort of slogging through things to figure it out. And I think that in order to be an effective senator, having that time in the House is critical. I watched people come into the Senate this 2 years ago and 2 years before that who hadn't had House experience. And I think it took them at least a year, if not two, to get up to speed on a lot of these things. There's a Republican senator who shall remain unnamed, who still, to this day, has no idea how the decorum works. The fact that, when you're voting and how that works in the Senate and how that works in the House. And, there were different rules in both, or how to talk to the media. That was something I needed a lot of help with. But in the Senate, there is a lot of help. It just takes time. And the other thing is in the Senate is to get used to legislative aides and how to make the best use of their time, which is something you don't get to do in the House because you have no help. So that part was wonderful. In the interest of time, I could say a lot more about how important House time was and how much I wish I'd had at least another term, if not two more. But I thought I'd ask you another question as well. And in last week's debate that many or some people on this may have seen at the Lebanon Democrats meeting, you debated against Sue Prentice, who is your opponent in the primary. I heard you raise as an issue Sue's lifelong Republican affiliation, while at the same time welcoming her to our side, being the Democratic Party. And my understanding is she joined the Democratic Party last fall. Can you explain how these two statements somehow coexist in your thinking?
Well, they do coexist, and I'm actually glad you're asking this question, because this is one of the issues that is more likely to be misinterpreted or misconstrued, and I think it's an important issue. Let me just begin by clarifying something. I have the greatest respect for Sue's work as a paramedic, as an EMS person, and as a city administrator in the city of Lebanon. And also, the second point that I want to clarify is that I was delighted that in October of last year, she had a change of heart and she decided to register as a member of the Democratic Party. And even more, the fact that she co-chaired Pete Buttigieg's campaign, because I think Pete Buttigieg was a fantastic candidate. So all those things just up front so that it's clear, what I think about Sue Prentice as a person and as a professional woman. But this is the New Hampshire Senate we are talking about. And we are talking about not only the Senate, but the Senate at a very critical juncture, which is the situation we find ourselves in as a result of the aggravation of many ongoing problems, plus the addition of new problems that this pandemic has brought to our state and to our country. In this current situation, it's always the case, but it's even more important now. We need to send to the Senate an experienced legislator, and also someone who is truly and deeply committed to democratic core values and to a democratic core agenda. Why is that so important? Well, it's important because, changing party and changing your party affiliation does not make you a Democrat, in the sense that a Democrat is someone who has a certain view of what's required, a certain view of people's needs, a certain view of where to move the country forward. And you don't learn that overnight, and you don't learn it, in 3 or 5 months. That commitment, I think, is crucial to being an effective legislator in all circumstances, but certainly now. In Sue's case, the truth is that her allegiance until very recently has been to the Republican Party. And the priorities of the Republican Party and the goals of the Republican parties are very different from those of the Democratic Party. Just to give you 2 examples, in 2016, when Sue was a member of the steering committee that was campaigning for George Pataki, George Pataki was someone who was in favor of the death penalty. George Pataki was someone who had as one of the number 1 priorities on his list, if he became president, to completely dismantle Obamacare. That is not an accusation, that is a fact, and it reveals a different view of the world. And I think that right now, we need someone who has very clear ideas and is very clearly committed to those ideas and those core values and those goals. And I don't think that the Senate is the place to learn those values. I think that by the time you get to the Senate, you must have embraced those values for a long time, and not only embraced, which is important, but learn to fight for them, learn to advocate for them. The lines have to be clear for you, and you have to know exactly what kind of war do you want to fight for, what kind of rights, what kind of issues, what kind of goals. And that's where my reservation comes, because I don't think that that's something that happens overnight. I think that we're talking about a long-term commitment. And that's why I think that this discussion is relevant for our conversation today, and is very relevant for our voters when they decide what candidate they feel can represent them better in the New Hampshire Senate.
Thank you.
But since we were talking about 2 issues, made me think about this question. First, what you said about how you had to learn to identify who to work with, who could support this or that or the other while you were in the House and in the Senate. And of course, that brought up the issue of partisanship. And also the fact that I have now brought up the issue of partisanship in saying, well, there are differences, fundamental differences between Republicans and Democrats, and one has to reckon with those differences. One has to reckon with them in the House, in the Senate, and at election time. And that's why I brought them up within the context of this election. But in your case, you work in the House and in the Senate. And I'd like you to talk about the issue of partisanship. How partisan did you find the House and the Senate to be? And how did you find a way to work around it? How important was that as a fact that you had to take into account in order to achieve the goals that you wanted to achieve, in order to move things in the direction you wanted to move them?
Well, good question. As you were asking the question, I was thinking, oh boy, partisanship is alive and well and thriving in both the House and the Senate. Witness the fact that in the House, the Republicans were trying to sabotage any bills coming forward by not being willing to change the rules, which we got very creative, but it was scary. I found early on, I found myself saying that I felt that as DC goes, so goes New Hampshire. With the current administration, we have a governor who very early on talked about being a supporter of Trump. A lot of the people who were elected into the Republican Party were also supporters of Trump. So it seemed, from what I've heard from people who've been on this in the Senate for 20 years, said to me, the first term I was in there, they said this is the most dysfunctional they've ever seen the Senate be. There were the discourse was very unpleasant. There was a lot of name calling. People were not paying attention to what I had seen as the decorum in the House and I expected in the Senate. In fact, David Pierce had told me before I was elected that in fact, I would find it much easier to get along with the Republicans in the Senate. And there were some for whom that was true, but there were many who were very angry. And then we gained the majority, they lost it. And it was like everything was fair game. It was very, very difficult. So, I think I was a little bit optimistic, and that's maybe a euphemism for naive, in that when I first got in the House and Senate, I really thought that people would be interested in my background. I was a child psychologist. I felt I knew a lot about what was best for children, for example. And I found pretty quickly something that I saw to be true through the rest of the time I was there, which was that the Republicans who disagreed with me did not. An example is that I would say that I thought that there were times when the parents did not know what was best for the children because it was clear that they had been, say, abusing the children. And the Republican Party would say to me, you can't take any power away from the parents. And so we had these differences of opinion, and it was clear to me no one was listening, and certainly nobody cared about my expertise. So I sort of, dusted off my ego and figured out how to move forward and how to talk with Republicans. And it really comes down to very simple things, which has to do with, I wanted to be heard, so I needed to be sure that the people who had different opinions from me felt they were being heard by me. And that worked some of the time. I'd say that by the end of the time I was there, I was often talking to Republicans all through the process of putting a bill together, then talking with them also about, trying to get support. And also, I knew which Republicans by the end there were about 3 that I could usually count on listening to me about my support. What they would often say to me is, I can't support you on A, but I can support you on B. And that's because their leadership, the Republican leadership, would say, no, it's a little bit tit for tat. I'm not going to let you support anybody on this issue, but I will let you pick one of those 3 issues, for example. And that was not the case in the Democratic Party, in my experience. In general, I have discovered that it is very clear that there's a lot more pressure on the Republicans from not only, our governor is also, of course, a Republican, and he puts a lot of pressure on the Republican Party, threatening not to support them if the Republican senators don't support him on the things he wants, for example. So I became empathic a bit about the fact that the Republicans were under a whole lot of pressure. And obviously, it was much easier to be in the majority than it was in the minority. You sort of, at the end of the day, in the minority, you think, well, I've just spent 10 hours last night trying to come up with the best possible explanation for why I think this bill should pass. And no one was listening. They're just going to vote against it anyway. And these past 2 years, that's what the Republicans thought about us. So it's an extremely partisan organization, no question about it. No one would say it's not. What do you see as the biggest obstacles when you've had to push for progressive democratic agendas in both the House, and what do you predict in the Senate?
Well, what you were just talking about rings a bell. It rings a bell because of the 6 years I was in the House, we had a Democratic majority the first 2 years. Then we had an abysmal, defeat in the second 2 years. That's when we lost. It was interesting because in looking at Representatives Hall, you could see the whole picture. When I arrived, we were sitting in comfort. We had basically the center and the best places in Representatives Hall, and it was wonderful. We felt like we were really in the center of the world. And then the 2010 election came. We lost so many seats, and we ended up in the rightmost corner, against the wall, where we could hardly see the monitor where they showed the number of votes. So that was the physical representation of the reality we lived in. But throughout the 6 years, what I found was that the major obstacles were, first of all, the Republicans. And they were an obstacle, not that you couldn't work with any Republicans, because the Committee on Science, Technology, and Energy was one of the least partisan committees because of the nature of the things we were discussing. But anytime that you got into anything that had to do with, climate action or whatever, you bumped into the same wall, whether it was RGGI or whether it was, energy efficiency bills or whatever. But it was the Republican first minority and then majority for the 2010-2012 period. You're talking about fundamental philosophical differences, and you're also talking about a different web of interests, political interests and economic interests. The alliances that the Republicans make are different from the alliances that the Democrats make. Yeah. And that really comes to the forefront when you're trying to negotiate anything from the legislature. So that was one of the big problems. And like I said, that doesn't change the fact that I was able to work with some Republicans very well. For instance, there was a bill that I worked on with Senator Odell, who was a Republican senator from District 8, and it was a bill to lower the electricity costs of the Union Block, an area in downtown Claremont, by creating a hot water heating district. And that's an example of working with a Republican, in this case, a Republican senator. And the bill went through, it was approved by the House and the Senate, and it was signed into law. So you could do that. But the basic fact was that anytime that you came up with progressive legislation, you had to bump against that wall. And it felt very much like a wall sometimes. And then the second big obstacle was the lobbyists. And I'll give you just two examples. With the energy efficiency bill, it was such a good bill, and it was good for everyone. And I bumped against the banking lobby because I had not anticipated it, which was very naive of me, but I had not anticipated it because to me it made so much sense. It was good. It was good for the consumer. It was good for the property owner. It was good for the environment, and it was good for the job market because it's the kind of initiative that creates a lot of local jobs. So I couldn't see any fault with it. Of course, it was my bill. But then the bankers pointed out to me very clearly that they saw plenty of fault with it. And I had to fight them tooth and nail. And the issue was very simple. They didn't want anybody to be competing with their lending business. And they definitely didn't want the municipalities to be able to bond and provide funds for those property owners to retrofit their houses. They wanted them to go to them and get those equity loans that they give when you go now. They used to talk about the granite countertops or the house remodeling or whatever. So that was the second thing. And when I did the broadband bill, the same thing happened because it was a very good bill, but again, it involved, in this case, not challenging the banks, but challenging the virtual monopoly of the big telecoms. Well, the bill went through the House, but when I went to the Senate, the big lobbyists of the telecoms were all lined up there, and everyone had a big folder that had been prepared for them. And that's where we lost the bill. We bumped into those big companies. So that's the second big obstacle. And then, but don't get me wrong, because you can bump into lobbyists and they can actually, derail your legislative agenda. But you can also work with lobbyists, and some lobbyists are extremely knowledgeable, and they can be a great resource when you are in the House, and I'm sure that's the case in the Senate as well. Yes. But then at least we had a better situation with the governor, because first we had John Lynch, and then when he stepped down, we had Maggie Hassan. But now I see a third major obstacle in the horizon, and that's going to be Sununu, who has distinguished himself by vetoing more progressive legislation that any governor had never seen. So that's something that I have to reckon with. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And that's hard. 57 vetoes just last year.
Absolutely. So I'm not thinking that it's going to be, a smooth ride or an easy ride, because the obstacles are real. But I think that we have a very good chance of moving progressive legislation forward, and hopefully we'll be able to see it, acted on as law, because we really need it. I mean, like I said, COVID-19 has made a lot of things critical, but most of those things were already a problem before. It's just broadband is a clear example. Now everybody sees it. Why? Because everybody needs it. But guess what? Everybody needed it before. It's just that a lot of people did not realize it. And the same thing is happening with so many other things. So there is going to be a lot of work to do. And I think that it's going to be a very exciting opportunity, actually, to do that work and move the state forward. Let me ask you a question, Martha. I know that, that may be my final question. I know that before you talked to me in the spring, because you did talk to me, I know that you talked to a number of other people who had expressed an interest in running for the Senate, and that you didn't just talk to them, but that you actually, I won't say that you grilled them, but I'll say that you interviewed them, okay? And the question I have, which to me has always been an important question, is why did you decide to endorse them?
Well, I'm happy to answer that question. When I decided that I wasn't going to run for another term, it was just the right time for me not to do that. I actually had a lot of pushback from people in the Senate and the staff and leadership. And of course, that felt very good. They wanted me to stay. I had developed some really important relationships with many people there. And but I stuck to my guns, and I felt a huge obligation to endorse someone whom I thought would be a logical replacement for how I had been in the Senate and who I had been in the Senate. Obviously, you have very different things about you as well, and expertises that are really important. But I wanted to make it as easy a transition to a new senator who would fit in and get to work right away. And so I interviewed with people. Actually, I ended up meeting and talking with, I think, 5 or 6 other people who were interested in running for the Senate. There were more of them in the beginning than there are now. So my first criteria was actually experience in the legislature. And most of the people I talked to did not have experience in the legislature. But I also cared a lot about people whose jobs had really relied on cooperation, on listening, on empathy, on, I'm biased because I've taught as well. I think teachers are very good at those kinds of things, and also at managing lots of different things going on at the same time. I did not want to have somebody from Hanover if I could avoid it, since I was from Hanover. And very importantly, once I knew that Martha Fuller Clark was leaving, I very much wanted somebody who could, and everybody wanted somebody who could help in the area of the environment, that, in climate crisis. She has been for many years the champion in that area. And I know she was thrilled when I told her that you were running for my seat. She very much hopes you win. I hope she doesn't mind my saying that. She's told me that. I wanted someone who had a sense of science and technology, and I'm the first to admit that's an area of weakness for me. When Cliff Bilo from Lebanon was a senator, he also was known for his interests in science and technology, and many people felt there was a bit of a hole after he left in that regard. So I thought, well, it'd be very nice for me to deliver somebody who was able to fill that space that needed to be filled. Of course, temperament, collegiality, all of those kind of things mean a great deal. I felt responsible to my caucus, to my staff members, whom I grew very close. I wanted somebody who would be easy to get along with, and somebody that would, I often say about myself that I take my job very seriously, but I don't take myself all that seriously. People will tell you that I can cut up a bit in the caucus, but the class clown. But I wasn't trying to replace that. I was trying to replace somebody who really cared about all the people that were there, including the staff. I wanted someone who had a long history of understanding and fighting for democratic principles. As you talked about, it is very, very important to me, and people downplay it. But I talked to at least 2 candidates, actually, or people who were interested in prospective candidates who were interested in running, who had been Republicans until very recently. And I acknowledge that I'm delighted that a lot of people have left the Republican Party at this time, and that probably Trump has done us that favor. I can't blame them for leaving. I'm also welcoming them with open arms. But as you've said, I had to think about who would be the best advocate for District 5. That really, in the end, is what it's all about. And it is, I have found that the other parties and the people who are in opposition are looking for little windows in which they can take you down or use you as an example against an argument you're making, or if they know that you're not strong on democratic principles, that they can try to convince you, and sometimes successfully, to go to a different side. I think that it is very, very important in this district, which is one of the most democratic, the other being actually the district that Martha Fuller Clark was from in Portsmouth, that we have someone who has experience of thinking like a Democrat, knowing instinctively what it is that the democratic principles are, and automatically understanding how to be a great Democrat. And that is something that mattered a lot to me. In this last term, I actually had a couple of caucus mates who had just barely won. They were from very Republican districts, and previously Republicans had held their seats. I have experience working with people who you can't tell whether for sure they're a Democrat or a Republican. And I found it enormously frustrating. And I know a lot of people in the caucus found it very, very frustrating. One huge difference between the House and the Senate is that one vote makes a huge difference. All it takes is one vote, and you can really mess things up for the kinds of principles we've all agreed to, when some people don't really understand what it is we're after and what we stand for. So I felt a responsibility to have a strong, solid Democrat who had served in the House or previously in the Senate, to work hard to replace myself with another true, long-standing Democrat who lives and breathes the issues that are, in fact, uniquely Democratic. So I was thrilled when you agreed to run, and that you were interested. I mean, you essentially ticked off all the boxes for me, and I'm thrilled. I don't really have more questions for you either, but I'm wondering if any questions have come up from our audience.
That's right.
Hi, absolutely.
Hello there.
So let's start with a question which is for Martha, and it's, Martha, if you could only give one piece of advice to someone who's considering running for the New Hampshire Senate, what would it be?
I probably wouldn't be giving advice to Republicans, so I'm going to say what advice I would give to a Democrat. But honestly, a lot of it is what I would give to anybody who is running for the Senate. It's humbling. It's really humbling. You can't go in if you've been successful in another part of your career, whether it's in local government or in corporations, or we had a couple of doctors who thought about running. It's really humbling because you're all in this together when you're in the Senate. So my most important thing I think you need to do is to do your homework, read about the issues, talk to people who have dealt with these issues in the past and know what the roadblocks are going to be, and really listen. I mean, as a politician, the thing that this maybe the greatest skill I had coming into it as a former psychologist was truly listening to other people. Because when you go to Claremont or Charlestown or Cornish or any of the other areas in my district, I was desperate to hear what they had to say. I wanted to know what the issues were for them. And if you're just talking about yourself and not listening, it really becomes a problem. So I think those are I probably said more than one, but that would be my answer. Good question.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we have another question from Joseph Murphy. What would you do in the Senate to build on your success with the PACE legislation you spoke about earlier? So this question would be addressed to Beatriz.
Yes.
Well, it's interesting because when we got a PACE through the House and it was signed into law, It was a program, a mechanism that could be used by residential as well as commercial buildings. And then came 2010 and the midterm election, and we lost the majority. And when we got back to Concord in January of 2011, one of the first bills that came to the floor, together with a flurry of bills that allowed people to carry guns in different positions, different circumstances, different modes of hiding in and inside Representatives Hall, which was pretty freaky. In addition to that, it was a bill to repeal PACE. And I said, well, what is this? It just got signed into law, and now they want to repeal it. Well, they did not. I spent the whole year fighting back. And I mean, really fighting back. And in the end, we were able to save PACE, but only for commercial. I still think that, and of course, commercial buildings are a big part of the energy consumption in the state. But I think that just leaving it to commercial fails to do two things. It fails to allow everybody else to clean up their act by, switching to less energy wasting habits. And also what it does is that it keeps the energy expenses for any household very high. So I think that we need to continue to push for an expansion of PACE or modified. It's not the only program that can achieve that, but certainly energy efficiency is still at the top of my list, because I think that we can do much better and that we should do much better. So that's one of the things that I plan to continue in the Senate, whether it's through an expansion of PACE or whether it's by turning into a more hybrid program that could achieve a greater success. A lot of things have happened since I left the legislature, and there are other options that we can look into, and I plan to look into every one of them.
Great.
All right, thank you. It looks like our next question is for both of you, and it's a question for you both. Martha, what's your favorite part of being a New Hampshire senator? And Beatriz, what are you most excited about taking on?
My answer is probably going to be a surprise to some people. One of the most exciting things that happened to me in the Senate was that I had two bills. I mentioned one, and I had another bill that came to me from a young person. So the sexual assault on college campuses came from a college graduate. But I also had a bill that was very unconventional in many ways. A young woman who was a senior in high school from the eastern part of the state came to visit me one August and said, I really want to change something in New Hampshire, and that is that there are many people in my high school, young women, who cannot afford to buy tampons and pads, and that menstrual equity was a real problem. And therefore, they weren't coming to school, or they weren't using hygienic alternatives. Well, this was not something I knew a lot about, but I talked to a professor who works on these issues on menstrual equity and period poverty around the world, and she also didn't know that this was going on in some of the high schools in New Hampshire. So with this 18-year-old who's now just about to start her sophomore year at Penn, she and I put together a bill that we got passed and signed by the governor. And so both experiences working with young people who were enthusiastic and energetic, and we worked together very equally on these bills. It was really exciting when they passed. So I think it's a lot of it is hearing what is on the minds of other people in New Hampshire. And I also want to bring a lot of young people into the system. So maybe not the answer people expected, but it's what brings me huge joy.
Perfect. And Beatriz, what are you most excited about taking on from the New Hampshire Senate?
Well, I'm very excited about taking on these two areas that I've been so invested in for such a long time, and really try to move them forward for real. I think that there is a window of opportunity there that I want to take advantage of. But that, yes, I'm very excited about that. But there's something I'm more excited about than this. And this is a different district for me. This is a very large district, and it's a district that goes from north to south, along the Connecticut. And I am from the northernmost tip. And then there are people who are from the southernmost tip, and that's Charlestown. And to me, the most exciting thing is the prospect of being able to get to know people in the whole state, not just the people who live around the middle part of the state, Lebanon, Hanover, Edna. No, people who live way down there, people from Claremont, people from Charleston, that whole area, and working by listening to what they have to say, by listening to what they need, working to really bring the whole state into a more prosperous, more, egalitarian, more, fair way, actually, because I see great inequalities. And I think that this is going to be probably one of the newest things that I will be doing, because that did not used to be part of my district when I was in Grafton 12. And it's probably one of the things that I care the most about, because I've seen those inequalities. I've seen what happens in a town like Charlestown when a Wayland company leaves because they decide that, their business is not what it used to be. And I think that we can be a much stronger district and a much stronger state if we work with every one of those towns. And working with them begins in listening to what they have to say and listening to what they need, and then taking that to the legislature and acting on it. That, to me, is the most exciting part of what I'm looking at in terms of going to the Senate, in addition to continuing with the work that I did in the House, and it still needs to be done.
Well, can I just jump in one more time to say I feel like you were luckily said the other thing that was my favorite. And there's no question that the friends I've made and the work I did in the southern part of the district was just wonderful. And I hope to keep in touch with all those people. And I know I can do that through you. So that's good. Wonderful people.
Great. We have one more question from the chat from Jake McGuire. Beatriz, I've done research about how Dems in the legislature and Governor John Lynch thwarted right to work in 2011, despite an enormous GOP majority. How do your experiences in both the House majority and minority prepare you for the Senate?
Well, I think that in a way, Martha answered that question for me earlier, because they're exactly the same things. The obvious thing is, when I went to the legislature the first time, I was able to talk Nada Kane, who was the chair of Science and Tech, into allow me to be a member of that committee. But the truth is that I didn't have a clue. I didn't have a clue. I had to learn the legislative process. I had to learn the acronyms, and I'm not kidding you. The acronyms are a serious issue, as Martha will tell you. I had to learn the acronyms. I had to learn the mechanics of the House. And then I had to learn how to make alliances. I had to learn how to make deals. All those things are absolutely crucial to the legislative process. And then I had to get an understanding of the issues. They were issues I had always believed in, but I had approached them as more as an academic. And you know what? Being a legislator is very different from being an academic. Because being an academic means that, you write something, you convince your colleagues, and, you carry some authority. And if you're really smart, that does it. It's not like that in the legislature. In the legislature, you're constantly aware of what other people need, and of what other people are willing to consider, and of what it will take for you to push through something that is better, something that is needed, but that you, with all your smarts and all your education and whatever, could never get through by yourself. And that is a humbling experience, because it really forces you to work with people in a way that may not be the way you worked with them before, but in a way that is really crucial to the success of the work that you do in the legislature. And it's interesting because, I have been involved in politics before. I've been involved in academic politics, and academic politics is serious business, and community politics and so on, but it is different. The work that you do in the legislature is different. And you don't learn it by, just talking to people. You don't learn it by certainly by studying it. You learn it by doing it, and by doing it, for a considerable period of time. Because if I had only had 2 years, I don't think I would have learned half as much as what I learned in the 2 following years when we were in the minority, which was a totally different experience, and then back in the majority. So yes, I think that it was not an easy apprenticeship, but it was a very important one, and I think it is a crucial one in terms of being truly effective, because that's what you're wondering. That's what you want to get, is not someone who understands the issues, someone who even has their heart in the right place and so on. And no, you need someone who has the skills. And the skills come from doing things in the legislature. They come from negotiating. They come from drafting bills. They come from amending bills. They come from going to the floor and defending those bills. They come to answering the questions. They come from all that. And that is an irreplaceable experience in my view. And I had plenty of it during my 6 years in the House. Yes.
I have to tell you, Beatriz, that when I first entered the House, you were just leaving when I entered.
That's right.
And I was almost intimidated by all the good things people would tell me about the work you did in the House. I thought, I'm never going to be able to do it as well. And they continue to do that now that I'm telling them that you're running for Senate. People from the House just rave about the work you did. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
Well, if there aren't any other questions, I have a question that I'd like to ask. And this can be for either of you or both of you. I was wondering, what do you think is the single greatest long-term challenge facing New Hampshire over the coming several decades?
Do you mind if I go first? People ask me this question a lot. And I hope we can solve some of this before a decade. But one of the there are many, of course, there are many. But if we can't fix voting, I don't think we can fix much else. If we are going to continue to have a governor or senators who are against having redistricting that's done by independent groups that understand redistricting, rather as it's done now by the party in the majority, we're never going to get to a point where there's a fairness and equity in terms of the state choosing the legislators rather than the legislators choosing the voters. And so that's one of the first things that I think that really has to happen. And so when people ask me what to work on, I often say, work on voter equity, work on fair elections. This is something that every citizen can go out there and do. And then we can think about a lot of the other things that are very important around that Beatriz has talked about, like income inequality and educational inequality and all those kinds of things. But I think, and the climate, but if we can't have fair elections, we're kind of doomed.
Well, I have to agree with Martha, because, either of us can come up with a list of really top priorities for the state. Education is a top priority. Healthcare is a top priority. Climate action is a top priority. Women's reproductive rights are a top priority. But the truth of the matter is that even though all those things sound very interesting and enticing, and they're really important, and even though voting rights doesn't sound very sexy, unless we get that in place, nothing else is going to work, and that's the bottom line.
That's right.
Yeah,
I agree with you, obviously.
Well, great. I just want to thank everyone who came, and thank you so much to Senator Hennessey for coming and speaking with us. Beatriz, do you want to close it out and have the final word?
Well, before she does, I just want to say thank you to Katerina and to Matthew and to others who have been helping make this happen. This was a lot of fun and it felt very professional to me. So thank you. And then I'll let you go, Beatriz. Sorry.
Well, you're seeing part of the team. The other part of the team is in the shadows.
Yes.
But there is another part of the team, and they've all managed to make this thing work despite, the
Yeah.
last minute crisis and so on. But I want to thank everybody for coming here and listening to us. And I want to thank especially Martha for having this conversation with me and for everything she's done as a senator all these years.
Thank you.
And for her support of my candidacy, which I appreciate very much. We will be having one of these chats every week, and they will be announced. You will get the announcement, and you will get the link. In addition to that, if you missed part of it, or if you know anybody who missed part of it or all of it and want to see it, every one of those events and every one of the other virtual events are going to be posted on my website. So all you have to do is go to my website at beatrizpastor.org, and there you can connect to everything. You can watch the videos, you can go to Facebook, you can do everything, and you can get to know more about Beatriz, because there is a section that is something like more about Beatriz. So there we go. Thank you very much.
Could I ask that somebody put your website in the chat just so everyone sees it, if it's not already there?
That would be good, yeah.
It's a beautiful website.
Because just with the website, you'll be able to get all the other links, connect to everything else that is part of our campaign.
Excellent. Thank you so much to everybody. This was a lot of fun.
Yes, it was fun, actually. Really was. Thank you.
Thank you.